Hello everyone. Today's episode will be a bit different from our usual style. This is more of a podcast format with some visual support, but much less produced, to explore some of the topics that didn't fit into the last episode on Godfrey and the Fortified Manor. We'll return as soon as we can with part 2 of that analysis, but for now, please enjoy this mini podcast-style episode where we explore the role of Serosh in the story of Godfrey. Myths and legend are powerful, unifying stories, as we've seen in our last episode, capable of inspiring and motivating when wielded by adept rulers. But they aren't just that. They often reflect real-world events and political circumstances, however faint and distorted by the lens of time. The creation myths contained within the Kojiki, for example, which are probably the oldest extant writing of any kind from Japan, recorded in the 8th century of the Common Era, but likely reflecting oral tradition centuries earlier, are good examples of this. They begin with the story of the creator gods, Izanagi and Izanami, and their creation of the associated pantheon, as well as the Japanese archipelago itself. One of the most famous stories within the Kojiki is the legend of two of these divine children, the sun goddess Amaterasu, and her brother, the wind or storm god Susanoo. The legend goes like this. One day, Susanoo destroys a bunch of his sister Amaterasu's stuff. She becomes so enraged that she runs and hides in a cave, called Iwato, a cave which is still considered sacred to this day. Amaterasu's hiding causes the entire world to be without a sun, which of course causes panic among the rest of the gods. Eventually, they lure her out of the cave by tricking her with a mirror, as she is so entranced and jealous at the light that she sees in the mirror that she assumes another sun goddess has taken her place. After luring her out, the other gods banish Susanoo from the realm of the gods to the earthly plane of Japan. Though this is a punishment, once on Earth, Susanoo slays a local dragon and is revered as a hero, later warding off disease and helping crop growth for the locals. Although he has clearly been subordinated to Amaterasu, he continues to be worshipped to this day in Shinto shrines in Japan, most famously the Susa shrine in Izumo, modern-day Shimane. The most common reading of this story is as a political allegory for the late Yayoi period. Effectively, it reflects the real historical events as it tells the story of how the Izumo clan, who worshipped the storm god, Susanoo, became subordinate to the clan that worshipped the sun goddess, Amaterasu, called the Yamato clan. This is a story with a clear political purpose, to legitimize the rule of the Yamato, and to establish the ruling right of their descendants of Amaterasu. Japanese emperors still claim descent to this day from Amaterasu. And so it is critical to the story that the storm god Susanoo, the one who nominally loses the struggle and is banished, is still made out to be a hero in the end, slaying the dragon and saving the villagers. The story simultaneously legitimizes Yamato rule while allowing the Izumo clan, which is subordinated, to be heroic and proud. It is the legendary reflection of a real-world political compromise. The Izumo agreeing to allow the emperors to descend from the Yamato clan, who they are subordinated to, while also preserving the role of the Izumo in the story. The point of going on this introductory tangent is to make the point that legends, while of course distorted, adapted, and evolved over time, often reflect a kernel of history, and in particular, often lend legendary drama to perhaps otherwise mundane political events. So it is, of course, with Elden Ring. Last time we discussed the legend of Lord Godfrey, clearly drawn from real-world Arthurian legend, attempting to peer behind the curtain of this myth to glimpse his origin story, using, as always, forensic archaeology as our guide. This time, we introduce a key player in that story, that of Godfrey's erstwhile enemy turned aged advisor, Serosh. The legend of Godfrey and Serosh, that the former Lord of Beasts Serosh was taken on as an aged counselor to the eventual Elden Lord, is exactly the sort of political fable that is told to legitimize the ruling right of the victor and his lineage, that is, Godfrey and the Golden Lineage, while also preserving the honor of the defeated. Just like the tale of Susanoo and Amaterasu, which reflects real-world political compromise and events, the legend of Godfrey and Serosh joining forces, so to speak, at the outset of his reign as Elden Lord, is highly interpretable. Last episode, we analyzed the fortified manor, deducing that it was, in fact, of an earlier era than the rest of Leyndell, and letting the Round Table itself tell the story of Godfrey's origins. Today, we introduce Serosh's role into that story, and the legend told which reflects this early history. Key to our analysis last time was the notion that while banners, paintings, sometimes even statues, may be replaced or moved, architecture may tell a deeper story. And while we believe this is correct in methodology, we did deliberately ignore one element of the fortified manor, the carved emblem of the Golden Lineage, Serosh, on the arcade of the manor. At first glance, this seems like a contradiction. After all, we said that the manor was built during the Saint and Great Tree stratum, before the peak of Leyndell, and yet here is an emblem of the Golden Lineage carved into its walls, seemingly of the original stratum. The resolution to that apparent contradiction, and the thesis of this video, is that at the time the manor was built, it was not an emblem of the Golden Lineage, but rather an emblem of the lord of this manor, Serosh, whose role in this story is much more significant than it may initially seem. Evidence for this comes in many somewhat circumstantial but overall convincing forms. First, we have the description of Serosh himself, who is said to be a, quote, Lord of Beasts who went on to become King Godfrey's regent, end quote, by the Beastclaw Hammer description. This pretty clearly states that before he was Godfrey's regent, he was already a lord, who subsequently became Godfrey's regent and advisor. Serosh, in both his artistic depictions in Stormveil, as well as in the boss fight cutscene, is depicted wearing a crown, likely meaning that this title of lord was not merely honorific, but that Serosh truly was a ruler of some kind. The Beastclaw Great Hammer is gifted by Geraint, aka Malekith, and its description also makes reference to Serosh's 5 claws. If you've seen our Furumazula video, then you will know that this is clearly a reference to Serosh's intelligence, as the 5 fingers are said by the Cinque Dea description to represent the intelligence once granted upon the beasts. So, Serosh was a noble, intelligent lord of beasts, likely connected to pre-destruction Furumazula, though we'll leave the full ramifications of that connection for another episode. With that partial view of Serosh's backstory in mind, let's now return to the forensics. Godfrey's Elden Throne Room in Stormveil Castle bears the unmistakable marks of iconographic replacement, as we will discuss in much greater detail in the next episode, but it bears some mentioning here. The Crucible statues seem to be later additions in front of pre-existing bronzes, showing an older libation ritual. Likewise, the bronze relief in the throne room of Serosh almost appears to predate the statue of Godfrey, which is placed in front. And of course, the Elden Throne itself, by definition a later addition since Stormveil was built before Godfrey became Elden Lord, is actually covering an emblem on the floor. What is odd about that is that the emblem appears to be that of the Golden Lineage, in other words, of Serosh. How could this be unless, somehow, the beast emblem predates Godfrey? As we know, Serosh was actually a lord prior to becoming Godfrey's advisor and regent. What was he a lord of, though? Well, we would propose, based on the evidence at hand, he was a lord of beasts, ruling from the fortified manor in Leyndell, and played a key role in ruling Stormveil prior to Godfrey's ascent. And Stormveil is of the same stratum as the fortified manor, hence why we see his visage carved into the fortified manor, a building older than the rest of Langdell, and on the manor tower shield. If it seems odd that a beast like Serosh would be Lord of Hawks, or at least Lord of the Stormhawks, consider that we see exactly this combination of hawks and beasts in Furum Azula, so this ancient alliance between beasts and hawks is not so implausible. Furthermore, as pointed out by last protagonist, while the description of Banished Knight Engval's and Oleg's ashes call them, in the English script at least, quote, wings of the storm, end quote, the Japanese script is much more explicit in linking them to the Stormlord, as they are called, quote, wings of the Stormlord, end quote. Check out his video on the topic for more context, but for our purposes, this fits quite nicely with the idea that the Lord of Stormveil and Fortified Manor, who was the Stormlord, commanded the legion now known as the Banished Knights. This would go a long way towards explaining why their armor is found in such density and reverential position in the Fortified Manor and Stormveil. These knights were the knights of the Stormlord, likely who is depicted on their helm, and who clearly had close ties with Serosh. As to why they would eventually become known as the Banished Knights, and whether Serosh was in fact the Stormlord, these questions will have to wait for a future episode. But we'll just add here that the relationship between Serosh, Lord of the Fortified Manor, and the Stormlord, who is likely the dragon depicted on the Banished Knight helm, nicely parallels the ancient relationship between dragon lords and their beastmen attendants, which goes all the way back to the time of Furum Azula. Now, remember that the round table found inside the Fortified Manor symbolizes Godfrey, with his bronze axe now embedded in the table, giving up his barbarian ways and agreeing to become Elden Lord. It is said that it was precisely this moment that he took Serosh on as regent and advisor. So, what weapon did he exchange his prior bronze axe for? Well, Godfrey's axe, of course, which is said to symbolize his vow to conduct himself as a lord. And where did he get this new axe from? Well, from his defeated foe, Serosh. Credit to Reddit user Kurenai Jack for pointing out that Godfrey's axe shares striking similarity to the Beastman's cleaver. We agree with this analysis. The engravings and the material are highly similar. Their shared shape even seems to suggest that the cleaver was made from what was once an axe, or perhaps vice versa. The simple wooden shaft and the iron used to produce the blade are identical. The subtle differences between the two weapons that the developers apparently went through the trouble of actually designing, namely the slightly more ornate pattern on Godfrey's axe, suggest that while they undoubtedly come from the same culture, the axe is the weapon of higher status, while the cleaver is likely the basic infantryman weapon, quite consistent with what we already know about the current beastmen of Furum Azula. All of this suggests that Godfrey's axe, before it was a symbol of him as Elden Lord, was actually a regal beast's weapon, and more specifically, it was Serosh's. There is precedent for defeated foes becoming trusted allies and advisors from both real history and legend. And sure enough, King Arthur's legend is informative once again. One of Arthur's closest knights in the Round Table, Galahad, begins his story as an enemy of Arthur, who then joins the Round Table after being awestruck by the battle prowess of one of Arthur's knights, who turns out to be Lancelot. Though the story comparison is admittedly somewhat loose, it's worth mentioning that Galahad's crest is a dead ringer for the beast crest, suggesting the inspiration may be real, though to be fair, lion crests are quite common in medieval heraldry. Regardless, the overall story arc seems pretty clear. Godfrey defeated Serosh in battle, after which Serosh became Godfrey's advisor. This is a story arc that actually FromSoft have used before, with Sekiro's Gyobo the Demon becoming Genichiro Ashina's most trusted retainer only after his defeat at the hands of the Ashina. If you accept our conclusions to this point, it begs the question, why does an axe of Serosh become the symbol of Godfrey's line, the golden lineage? Well, once again, real-world history can help give context to this. It is extremely common, actually, for a king to seek legitimacy by claiming descent or lineage, or cultural heritage at least, from a more powerful ancient ruler. And often this is done through the deliberate use of ancient cultural symbols. History is actually rife with such examples. Think of Charlemagne negotiating with Pope Leo to be crowned Roman Emperor, the first Roman Emperor in more than 300 years since the fall of the Western Empire. But to stay on theme, let's look at how history and legend intersect once again in the tale of King Arthur and King Edward I. Edward I, who lived in the late 13th to early 14th century, was a Norman king, actually of the same Norman line that built all those castles we discussed last episode as inspirations for Stormveil and the fortified manor. Indeed, Edward himself famously built many of those castles in Wales. You may know him as Longshanks, the villain in Mel Gibson's Braveheart, but his story is much more interesting than that. As a Norman, that is to say, a French-speaking descendant of the Vikings that had invaded the Frankish kingdoms a few centuries earlier, he is effectively an outsider and part of a ruling minority. The Normans were notoriously brutal in their regime of elite replacement and subsequent repression of the local Anglo-Saxons. French was the only language to be spoken in official discussion and used in official documents, and native Anglo-Saxons, that is to say, English speakers, were by and large not permitted to be involved in high-level politics or hold high office. But Edward, like all great rulers, knew that some way to engender local support was necessary for effective rule, and to avoid the civil strife that had plagued his father's rule. This was especially true in Wales, which Edward ended up conquering and unifying with England. And for this, he turned to the power of Arthur's legend. Remember from last time that Arthur, if he lived at all, lived in the 5th or 6th century AD, several hundred years before Edward, and was a local Romano-Briton who fought against the invasions of the Anglo-Saxons. He appears first in the historical record in several Welsh poems as a mighty warrior. Then, the story as we know it today first appears several centuries later in Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-historical document, The History of the Kings of Britain. During his rule, Edward deliberately modeled himself off of Arthur in order to gain legitimacy. When he conquered the Welsh, Edward staged a coronation ceremony with a crown he claimed had been worn by Arthur himself. On Easter Day, 1278, he staged an elaborate ceremony for the opening and reinterment of the remains of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. Not their actual remains, mind you, but remains that had been conveniently, quote, found by monks at the site. With these two ceremonies, Edward seemed to at once be confirming the death of Arthur. In fact, he left the supposed skull of Arthur exposed on display, and claiming effective descent from Arthur himself and authority to rule the area. Subsequently, he staged jousting festivals known as Round Tables at Winchester, which he said to be the site of Arthur's seat. And at Winchester Castle, he, or perhaps his son, even commissioned the construction of a literal round table, still viewable to this day, to solidify the point. Edward adeptly wielded the power of Arthur's legend to claim legitimacy of rule of the Anglo-Saxons. His successors, of course, including Normans and the subsequent Plantagenets, would do much of the same, clinging to the legend as a source of legitimacy for a ruling minority. So, in this light, it is not so surprising, then, that Godfrey would use his relationship with Serosh, the Lord of Beasts of a much more ancient ruling line tied to Farum Azula, to help legitimize his claim to rule. Nor is it surprising that his descendants, the Golden Lineage, would in turn also venerate the image of Serosh as a symbol of their line, as it symbolizes their connection to this ancient culture and ruling dynasty. And so now finally, we will briefly turn to Godrick, the so-called dregs of the Golden Lineage, who is so desperate to impress and claim power from his predecessors. In this new light, it is understandable that Godrick would fashion a weapon, a new golden axe, which, like Edward's Round Table, clearly is made much later, in an effort to deliberately draw from the totemic power of Godfrey's axe. And, in an extremely clever bit of storytelling and characterization, Godrick's axe reproduces only the superficial features of Godfrey's weapon, while reproducing none of the characteristic designs or material usage. What was an iron weapon with a wooden shaft and bestial engravings is now an ostentatious golden axe meant to evoke the glory of the golden lineage. This weapon says quite a bit about Godrick, that he is so desperate to claim descent from a once great lineage, but that he ultimately knows nothing of its true origins. So, to summarize what we've learned thus far, we would propose that Serosh was the lord of the fortified manor, and played a key role in ruling Stormveil prior to Godfrey. Godfrey defeated him, perhaps in single combat, what is alluded to in Godfrey's armor set, and likely the origin story of that scar which runs across Serosh's face and divides his crown. When he won, Godfrey forged a new alliance with his vanquished foe. Serosh offered his service and his axe to Godfrey. Godfrey exchanged his old bronze axe, the one that had scarred Serosh, for a new weapon symbolizing his new rule and his new connection to the ancient rulers of Furumazula, much like Edward crowning himself with the supposed crown of Arthur. Well, that concludes our analysis of the legend and history of Godfrey and Serosh. Like the story of Susanoo and Amaterasu, it reflects a real-life political compromise that also served to legitimize the monarchical lineage. Join us next time when we resume our standard style of video to explore the story of America in this story, in the time of the Crucible, before the age of the Erdtree.